Okay, we are back. I have been carving or cutting like crazy for about 2 hours, and I think I've gotten most of the reductive block carved. I'm going to see if I can show a more raking light on this and see if it helps you see the depth of the cuts a little bit better. Um, in some areas, I've pulled away quite a bit. In other areas, it's going to be a little bit more shallow, so we'll have to see whether I've carved things deep enough. And I also noticed that here it tore off in kind of an irregular pattern, but I'm going to see if I'm hoping that might suggest some sort of background off the deck, like some foliage or something. So I'm going to try to leave that and intentionally let some of these rougher areas pick up a little bit of the ink as I do the brayer across there. And I also had some areas, I did try to keep these lines in here. I was pretty happy with how I was able to cut those deep enough that they didn't just peel off. But I did accidentally cut away a couple of them right in here. So I ended up just cutting little strips of cardboard and gluing them back in there. We'll see if they can hold up to the inking process. They're not quite as durable as the actual original lines would have been, but we're ready to seal things. So this is gloss acrylic Liquitex. It looks kind of bluish because I put it in a jar that had, I thought I had cleaned it out pretty well, but it had a little residue of the Aqua ink still in there. So mine looks blue, yours should look white. When it dries, it will be clear. And if you don't have some clear acrylic Liquitex, you can use house paint. In fact, white gloss house paint works really great because it wipes clean pretty easily and it's light enough that you can see the color of your ink on there. But really, you could use any kind of acrylic house paint to seal your block. The lighter the color, the better as far as being able to tell if you've cleaned the plate thoroughly after you've inked it and things like that. But even using a black paint could work. It's just that it would be really hard to tell whether you got enough ink on the block once the acrylic sealant has dried. So I prefer a clear sealant or a white sealant is ideal, but a middle value is great too. If you don't have gloss acrylic or house paint, you could even use something like the PVA glue, the white school glue. It if you're printing on damp paper or if you're printing with water-soluble inks, it's possible that the water in the inks could reactivate the glue and make it a little bit sticky when you're pulling your print off, but this you could also use in a pinch. So let's go ahead and start sealing our plate. You want to be careful when you're using your clear gel, your acrylic, that you don't just like drip it out of here, because this also is like a glue and it will glue the lid right on your container if you're not careful. So do always make sure you wipe the drips off pretty carefully. And this is a cheap chip brush from a hardware store. You can use any kind of brush. Just make sure you rinse out the acrylic really well after you've used your brushes so that you don't ruin your brushes by letting the acrylic dry in your brush. So we're just going to apply a pretty thin layer on here. It is going to turn my plate a little bit blue, I'm afraid, but shouldn't matter. And I'm really being conscientious to work the sealant, especially on the edges of these pretty delicate, fragile little tiny pieces. So I'm sort of smoothing out the texture of the paper as well. There are some really rough areas, but the acrylic sealant helps kind of smooth those areas down, and I'm going to work down into all these little tiny grooves that I've cut in the seats of the chairs, and I want to be kind of careful that I don't pull up any loose bits. I'm watching for that as I'm brushing, and if anything pulls loose, I can just take a minute and carefully kind of glue it back down. But kind of, you don't want a super heavy layer. You don't want it so heavy that you're seeing the brush strokes of the gel medium create its own texture. You want to try to just apply it in a nice thin layer. You could even water down your acrylic gel if it seems like it's too thick or it's leaving bold brush strokes. I'm looking at the amount of shine on the plate to see if I've got good coverage on there as well. And I'll probably end up doing 2 thin coats of sealant, but let the 2 layers dry in between each other. So maybe let it dry overnight and then add another layer. You don't want to goop it on so heavily that you start to lose your shapes. You don't want to have, you want to keep those nice straight lines, printing cleanly. Okay. I'm kind of brushing in the direction of the cut marks to help pull the excess sealant out of there. Alright, well, it looks slightly glossy. I feel like I've gotten at least a thin layer on every surface. And I want to make sure I coat the back as well so that I can wipe ink off of there if I get ink on the back somehow. I see this little pieces curling up here at the edge, so I'll put a little bit of gel medium underneath that, and we'll try to pin it back down with a X-Acto knife. See if it'll dry back in place. The other thing I noticed as I was doing the cutting is when I was cutting really deep with the X-Acto blade, I could actually feel a raised surface where I had scored it. And so before I sealed it, I also went over the whole plate with the back side of a wooden spoon to help flatten the plate out again. So if you can feel a lot of variation in the surface in areas where you want it to be flat, you can burnish back the paper so it's flat again and you don't have those burrs that will pick up the ink in an unexpected way. Alright, so this one, the front has been coated. I don't want to lay it down and coat the back until the front is completely dry, but I will be painting the back side as well, a nice thin coat. And then this is the one that I glued down. I had actually put 1 coat of sealant. I don't know if you can see it's slightly shinier. Yeah, there. I had a coat on there because I was just testing to see how well whether it curled up the board. So there's actually 1 coat on here. Normally you wouldn't already have a layer on there, but I want to make sure I seal this plate really well too. So I'm just kind of working that acrylic into all the crevices. I don't want to have brush strokes when I'm done, but I'm going to start out just by like really working the acrylic into those little corners, and then I'll do a last surface brushing to make sure everything's got at least 1 layer on it. Make sure you hit the edges of the block too. I think I forgot to do that on the other one, so I'll go back and do that as well. You don't want to have it all collecting on the edges there, so once you've done the edges, go back over the top and smooth it out again. And make sure you didn't gunk up the back. Alright, so I can see some brush strokes on here. I want to go back over this and try to get rid of any of those thick areas. Remember, you can add a little bit of water if you feel like the stuff is just too thick. You can also play around if you like the effect that the brush strokes give you. You might deliberately think about leaving some of those brush strokes and then ink with a really thin layer of ink and see if you can pick up some of those brush textures. But if you do that, make sure that you're kind of applying the brushed marks in a deliberate way so it reinforces the shapes that are on your design and they don't compete with it. So All right, that's a pretty subtle texture, but it's possible that some of those strokes may show up in the inking because it's a low relief texture of its own on top of the major cut shapes. All right, I'm going to set these to dry. I will go over the back side with a layer of gloss. This had one, again, I was doing some tests, so this has some gloss on it already, but I do want to make sure they dry really well. And I'll let it dry for half an hour or so until it's safe to touch it, and then I will weigh it down so that it dries nice and flat again, so that we don't have to worry about it curling on us as it dries. You might find that when you first have just one coat of acrylic sealant on it, the plate may start to curve, but the minute you coat the back side, it should flatten out again and lay a little bit more level again. All right.